Welcome to the History Unplugged podcast, the unscripted show that celebrates unsung heroes, myth-busts historical lies, and rediscovers the forgotten stories that changed our world. I'm your host, Scott Rank. Everyone, in this episode, we're going to be talking about new theories of the disappearance of the Roanoke colony and why the term disappearance might actually be incorrect and what has led us astray for almost 200 years. If you don't know the background, in 1587, 115 men, women, and children arrived at Roanoke Island on the coast of North Carolina. The colony was chartered by Queen Elizabeth I, and the goal was to establish England's first foothold in the New World. But John White had to return to England to resupply the mission. He couldn't return for 3 years, and when he came back, the colony was gone, and there was only a single clue, a token carved into a tree. And neither White nor any other European laid eyes on the colonists again. There's been theories for the last 400 years about what happened to the colony, and it's led to dead ends, a lot of hoaxes, and weird conspiracy theories too. But today, I'm speaking with author Andrew Lawler, who's written a book called The Secret Token, Myth, Obsession, and the Search for the Lost Colony, who's spoken with archaeologists, and he has an answer, or the most plausible explanation about what happened. What he talks about is why the history of the Lost Colony has had such a huge impact on American consciousness and why it continues to haunt the American national consciousness. We also get into how history can be subverted for political and ideological ends. So a lot here to unpack and to take another look at a somewhat well-known story. So I hope you enjoyed this discussion with Andrew Lawler. Andrew, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much, Scott. It's great to be here.
Yeah, I'm really interested in digging into this story. I love topics that people have a general knowledge about, but they've either forgotten most of it or they have made assumptions that turn out not to be true in light of new evidence. And that's exactly what we're going to do here. And before we get into your take on the disappearance of the Roanoke colony, what got you interested in this story initially?
Well, I was a very young child when my parents would drag me to an outdoor drama called The Lost Colony that took place and still takes place to this day right at the site on Roanoke Island where the colony originally settled. And we would go there and watch this 3-hour costume drama, basically in the dripping heat of the North Carolina summer. And after doing that for about a dozen years, let me tell you, I was done with the Lost Colony. There were at least 10 million mosquitoes along with 115 colonists who got lost there. And I thought that was it. Because there was no new data. There was nothing more to say. There were some documents that we've had for several centuries to argue over, but there was really no new evidence. And it was only much later, decades later, when I was at a conference in England and I ran into an archaeologist. I write about archaeology and science. And I asked him where he was digging. And he said, I'm digging in a little place called Hatteras. And I said, Hatteras Island on the coast of North Carolina? He said, well, indeed. Have you heard of it? And I said, well, yes, I have, because I know that's the place where the colonists were rumored to have gone to from Roanoke. And I said, well, did you find the colony? He said, well, as a matter of fact, we did. And I was astonished by this. But then as soon as he found out I was a journalist, he refused to speak further to me. And it took me about a year and a half to get his attention and convince him to let me come visit his dig.
Okay, I'll have a lot of follow-up questions about this and his publishing work. I guess we could circle around a bit. First of all, just to set the stage for Roanoke, for those who don't know the story very well, could you describe what is mostly agreed upon factually of how the colony is set up? And before it completely disappears, what are facts that are mostly agreed upon about the colony?
The whole scene of the Roanoke voyages takes place in the 1580s. There's nearly a century after Columbus, and by this point, Spain has a vast empire that includes most of the New World. England, by contrast, is a pretty small, poverty-stricken country that doesn't even have a navigator who could get to the New World and back. So the English were really far behind and had not tried to settle the New World. So what happened in 1584 was that Sir Walter Raleigh, who was a courtier in Queen Elizabeth I's court, convinces her to let him send a couple of ships to the New World to scope things out. And they do that. And the following year, in 1585, Raleigh sends a large colony to the Outer Banks of North Carolina to set up what is both a pirate base to try and try and grab Spanish shipping, because remember, all the Spanish ships coming up the Gulf Stream from the Caribbean are carrying gold and silver bullion, all kinds of good stuff. And the English are interested in getting that good stuff, stealing from the thief, as it were. And also they're interested in the New World itself to see if they can find metal and other precious objects, as well as pharmaceuticals that might provide some benefits for England in that day. So the colony settles. There are about 100 and odd men. They settle on the north end of Roanoke Island in the middle of an area controlled by Algonquin Indians, Algonquin-speaking Indians of the Outer Banks. And in 1586, they decide it's time to leave because they've gotten hungry, they've been fighting with the Native Americans, and they hitch a ride with a fleet that passes by, led by Sir Francis Drake, the famous privateer. So they'll go back to England, and that might have been the end of English interest in the New World. But what happens is that a few of Raleigh's friends convince him to try again. And this is where our Lost Colony comes in. So in 1587, a whole new batch of colonists arrive on Roanoke Island, about 115 men, women, and children. Very unusual. They're sending women and children as a sign that they want this to be a permanent settlement. And they arrive on the shore of Roanoke Island and resettle the town that had been built previously. And at that point, the governor, John White, he decides it's time to go back to England to pick up new colonists, to get more supplies, because the winter's coming. So he sails away in August of 1587, and he leaves behind not just the colonists, but his own daughter, Eleanor Dare, and his granddaughter, Virginia Dare, the first English child born in the New World, who has just been born on Roanoke Island after their arrival. So White gets in a ship, sails back to England. By the time he gets back, war with Spain has broken out, and the Queen says no ship shall leave England. So White spends the next 3 years desperately trying to get back to the Outer Banks to check on the colonists and carry them supplies. He's unable to do so until August of 1590. And on Virginia Dare's third birthday, he lands again on Roanoke Island. He finds the settlement deserted. Now, the two clues that we have are, one, a post on which is carved the word Croatoan. And Croatoan is a word that we know now was Hatteras Island, what we call Hatteras Island today. The second clue is that John White mentions that the colonists had intended to move 50 miles inland, that is 50 miles to the west. So Croatoan is 50 miles to the south, and John White also says the colonists had intended to move 50 miles west into the mainland. So those are the only clues we're left with, because a storm blew up, forcing John White to sail back to England, and he never returns. So at that point, in 1587, we lose all track of the colony in historical documents.
Okay, so let's get into the theories of what happens. There are mainstream accounts, but from the little I've looked at this topic, there's also ridiculous fringe ones, and I'm sure you come across some great ones there. What are some of the mainstream interpretations? And if you have any favorite conspiracy theories, feel free to throw those in as well.
Well, boy, there's quite a long list of what could have happened to the colonists, in part because we've had so little data to provide evidence for one particular theory. But clearly, some of the theories are that they were massacred by the Indians, they were massacred by the Spanish. The Spanish viewed the colony as a nest of pirates that they wanted to clear out to protect the sea lanes from English ships. Or there might have been they might have starved to death. In fact, there is new evidence that there was a terrible drought that afflicted this area in the 1580s and 1590s. Of course, there might have been disease. And then if you go online, you can find everything from A to Z, from aliens to zombies, to explain what happened to the colonists. Now, of course, the one theory which hasn't gotten a lot of attention, or didn't get a lot of attention until the past few decades, has been perhaps the most obvious one of all. And that is that the colonists, abandoned by their own people, abandoned by the English, they simply melt into the Native American population and become Indian.
If I'm not mistaken, the Melungeon Tribe, do they trace their ancestry back to this mingling of two cultures?
Some of them do. The Melungeons are a very mysterious group that live primarily in the Appalachians in Virginia. And they make a lot of claims. They have a lot of oral traditions, some that they took in lost colonists. They were Indians who took in lost colonists. Others, they were Portuguese explorers or Spanish explorers who ended up in the mountains of Virginia, which is not terribly far-fetched because we know the Spanish had forts in western North Carolina. So, yes, the Melungeons have these traditions, but there's really very little evidence that the colonists would have traveled several hundred miles inland across what would have been enemy territory.
Right. If you're fighting starvation conditions, that's not a great time to go on a Lewis and Clark expedition.
Exactly.
So this gets us back to the story you were telling initially when you touched base with this British archaeologist. So what is your take on the fate of the Roanoke colony?
Well, let me back up a little bit because, as I mentioned at the beginning, I really wasn't too interested in this story because there hadn't been much new evidence. But then in about 3 or 4 years ago, suddenly I learned that, in fact, there were archaeologists that were actually digging for physical clues of the lost colony. Now, that got me interested because to find actual physical evidence would really be a game changer. So I visited 2 sites, one on Hatteras, today's Hatteras, being dug by the University of Bristol in the UK, and the other being dug by the First Colony Foundation at a place called Site X. And how Site X was found is very interesting. There was a map that John White, the governor of the colony, drew back in 1585. And that map has on it a small patch. And a researcher at the University of North Carolina in 2012 asked a simple question: what's under the patch? So when the British Museum, which has the original map, put it on a light table, they saw underneath this patch a clear image of a fort. And what's interesting is that the location of this patch on the map is exactly 50 miles inland, 50 miles west of Roanoke Island. Now, if you recall, that's where John White said the colonists had intended to go when he left in 1587. So this gave archaeologists a place to look. So you had 2 competing teams, one digging on what had been called Croatoan, now Hatteras Island, the other digging at Site X in Bertie County in eastern North Carolina, 50 miles inland, trying to find physical evidence of the colonists.
Okay, so yeah, what happens with this? This is really interesting.
So let me start with Site X, because it's interesting. They began digging in what had been a Native American village. So this is a place where Native Americans had lived in the 16th and 17th centuries. We know that from previous excavations and pottery on the surface. Now, when this team began to dig, they uncovered some really interesting finds, including this very unremarkable looking green pottery. Now, if you or I were to find this in our backyard, we wouldn't think twice, but it got the archaeologists very excited because they recognized this as a kind of English pottery called borderware that was made in the 16th century in England. So this was pretty clear evidence that you had English people living with Native Americans. Now, the big question is, okay, were these the lost pots of the lost colonists? Now, the archaeologists have a very complicated argument for why they believe it is so. I'm a little skeptical because this pottery was actually made well into the 17th century. And by that point, you have another wave of English that move in through Jamestown, which is the first permanent English settlement, about 100 miles to the north. Traders moved down by the 1650s and 60s into this area that is in eastern North Carolina. So it's possible that pottery could have been brought by later English. They're still analyzing it. It's still a big controversial question, and I go into some detail about that in my book, The Secret Token, kind of weighing the pros and cons of their claims. Now, the second dig, Croatoan, today's Hatteras Island, is also fascinating because the archaeological team also was working, as the other team was, in a Native American village. So they're digging at a site we know was primarily a settlement for Native Americans in the 16th and 17th centuries, so just the time frame of our lost colonists. And when they dug, they uncovered some astonishing material, including a little bit of a rapier, and that is the hilt of a gentleman's dress sword that was clearly Elizabethan.